From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Biden gives a national address on Israel, Ukraine, and America's role in the world as House Republicans move on from Jim Jordan as their nominee for Speaker. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Bill McGurn and editorial board member Kate Batchelder-Odell. President Biden addressed the American public on foreign policy in remarks from the Oval Office Thursday night. He included analysis of the war in Ukraine, the war in Israel, and more. And here's a piece of what he said.
So let me share with you why making sure Israel and Ukraine succeed is vital for America's national security. You know, history has taught us that when terrorists don't pay a price for their terror, when dictators don't pay a price for their aggression, they cause more chaos and death and more destruction. They keep going, and the cost and the threats to America and the world keep rising. So if we don't stop Putin's appetite for power and control in Ukraine, he won't limit himself just to Ukraine. Putin's already threatened to remind Poland that their Western land was a gift from Russia. One of his top advisors, a former president of Russia, has called Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania Russia's Baltic provinces.
Bill, what's your read of President Biden's speech? Maybe this is the first time I can recall him making the argument that Ukraine's victory, its defense, is in America's national interest.
Yes, I think it was. And that's been a big flaw because the president has committed all this money there and has not deigned to tell the American people really why. I think there's a good case for supporting Ukraine, but the president hasn't made it, and that void is having an impact. The Republicans are all over the place, a lot of them thinking Ukraine has no bearing on American interests falsely, and there's a lot of confusion. And I think the president thus far has chosen political expediency. He'd rather see the Republicans in disarray than have a clearly articulated Ukrainian policy. He's never used the word victory, for example. We want the Ukrainians to win and Russia to withdraw. So that was overdue. And then perhaps putting it in the context of Israel was just too much freight for this speech. You know, having written a bunch of Oval Office wartime addresses, I thought this was appalling. There were a lot of cheap talk about standing up to aggressors, but I think he let the main argument go through. Minimal mention of Iran, the greatest troublemaker, whose proxies are even now firing on U.S. assets in the region, and overlooked a chance to appeal the better instincts of Republicans and their history in all this. So I was very let down, and I was prepared to like it. I mean, I went into it thinking, well, he didn't mention Iran, Jerusalem. Maybe that's okay. What they really need is just here. We have your back. But I think we got the usual Joe Biden, a lot of moralizing and not a lot of heft.
Kate, what was your view of the speech? And do we have a more specific sense of what President Biden is asking Congress to pass? One thing that he said was that he wants Congress to do an unprecedented commitment to Israel's security that will sharpen Israel's qualitative edge, including making sure the Iron Dome system can guard the skies there. And then on Ukraine, he said all Ukraine is asking for is help for the weapons, munitions, the capacity, the capability to push invading Russian forces off their land, and the air defenses systems to shoot down Russian missiles before they destroy Ukrainian cities.
So, Kyle, on the speech, perhaps I'm digging for a pony here in somewhere, but I do think the president deserves some credit for finally laying out Ukraine as a vital security interest of the United States. We have been calling in editorials for him to give a primetime address about it, and he hasn't done so for almost 20 months. And he now really kind of was forced to do so because the attack on Israel on October 7th made his position untenable. But I do think he deserves some credit for at least trying in some way to explain that these fights are not necessarily distinct. And he did mention, for instance, that Iran and Russia are working together, that Iran is supporting Hamas, and that Iran is also supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, I, of course, would have liked to see him go into a lot more detail about that because it is an opportunity to educate the American public about really the alarming extent of Russia's cooperation with Iran. You have Iran seems to have sent military personnel into Ukraine to train Russians on Iranian drones. You have Russia appears to be sending training jets for Iran to use for its military. This is a real deepening cooperation. They're working together to try to kick U.S. forces out of Syria. So I thought that was a missed opportunity there. But I guess I am looking to give him some credit for at least trying to start to make this case to the public that the public really needs to hear it if it's going to continue to support sending money over to Ukraine. Now, the president also laid out about a little more than $100 billion of requested money to Congress. About $14 billion of that is for Israel, and that is largely focused on lethal aid. And for instance, some of it will be helpful to the United States to potentially starting a U.S. production line for Iron Dome interceptors. Those are the interceptors that Israel is burning through very quickly, trying to fend off barrages of Hamas rockets. The request includes $60 billion for Ukraine, and that I think some of Ukraine's critics will say, well, wow, that's a lot of money. It is. It's supposed to help Ukraine for hopefully a full year. But also, I would really point folks to a lot of this money is going to priorities such as replenishing U.S. stocks of stuff that we've already donated to Ukraine and getting better stuff for the U.S. military, replacing old Humvees with newer vehicles, for instance. There's also money in there for U.S. troops that are deployed in parts of Europe and working overtime, monitoring the NATO border. That's been a fixed expense. And there's also a lot of money in there for expanding U.S. weapons production, ammunition lines such as the 155 millimeter artillery shell. So there is a lot of money in there that really is focused on U.S. military power. It's not just a bill for Ukraine and Israel. The last thing I'll just throw in real quick, there's $3 billion for U.S. submarine industrial base production. This is a huge deal in the Indo-Pacific to try to get more submarines on station. So I guess my quick bottom line is there's a lot in this bill that is about U.S. military capability and not necessarily just about Ukraine or Israel, despite the headline numbers.
But the idea of linking these things in one package through Congress is already being criticized by some Republicans. This is Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, 2024 presidential candidate, speaking at Winthrop University yesterday in South Carolina.
My sense about what Biden's doing, he knows the Ukraine money is not popular with the public because they've spent a lot. They haven't put a clear objective to it. It's kind of a stalemate. A lot of that money is going to social services and salaries for bureaucrats and things that American taxpayers do not want to be funding. So he understands that there's a political problem. And I think he thinks if he can attach Israel and just throw a bunch of money there, then because it's Israel, everyone's going to have to say yes. But I think the Congress is not going to just eat that.
And Bill, what's also notable about DeSantis is he always seems to want to have both sides of this, even on Israel. So this is what he said a little bit later in those same remarks. He said, I think that by and large, the support for Israel is going to be important, but I don't think it's going to be tens of billions. I really don't. I don't think they're asking for tens of billions. And I think that is what we would save money by just saying, do the job and take out Hamas. And so it's strange to me. You hear from some quarters that the U.S. is doing too much to help Ukraine, but those same people are kind of hedging on helping Israel as well.
Yeah, I think it's kind of to be expected from DeSantis or other Republicans. Finally, I'd say about Biden's speech, a wartime president doesn't get trophies for effort. You have to do it. When you have an Oval Address, it's usually for some specific reason. Under Bush, we did it to get a bill through Democratic Congress to fund the war when they were threatening to cut off funds. We did it for the surge and so forth. Joe Biden, Kate made a better case than he did. The real case to be made that would put Republicans on the defensive is to call them to join in unity. What do these wars have in common? What do the bad actors have in common? Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. They all want to topple the U.S.-led world order that has prevailed for decades and largely kept us from a big all-out war. It's been very successful. And I think he could have put Republicans on the spot, but not by attacking them, by calling them to be true to their heritage in supporting this kind of effort. And I think the namby-pamby wording on democracy, it's not going to convince anyone that doesn't already agree with the aid. You know, when I was working for Bush, he would say, you got to make an argument that persuades the mother of a mom of a Marine in Ohio that this is in our interest. Those people are willing to hear from their president. They're willing to sacrifice for the country, but they have to hear the case. And I think we heard abstractions. DeSantis is what I meant before when it said filling the void. This put Republicans in a bad way. On DeSantis himself, I think, one, this is kind of a tradition he has, kind of calculating and trying to split the difference. He's running not to alienate Trump voters rather than to be Ron DeSantis. And I think it hurts him. It looks calculating and insincere. And secondly, I think he's just wrong. I think the two are linked, as I said, in a way that classic Republican principles would argue that we push back, because if America is replaced as a world leader, it's going to be no one good. Do we really want China, the dominant force in the trade routes in Asia, or Russia intimidating the other countries in Europe, or Iran in the Middle East? I don't think we do, and I don't think Ron DeSantis helped his case for president with those remarks.
I also just find some of this generic rhetoric unpersuasive. I think you need to go look at the numbers and the data. There's a German research institute called the Kiel Institute for the World Economy that has a Ukraine support tracker. And according to its figures, commitments by the United States are about 70 billion euros to date, and EU countries plus EU institutions is 132 billion euros. And so a much bigger commitment by some of these European states than I think much of the political rhetoric in the United States would lead voters to believe. And it's true the breakdowns differ somewhat. So more than half of the United States support, according to this tracker, is military aid, whereas a bigger proportion of it coming from Europe is financial aid. And that sort of makes sense. I think it's a shame that Europe's military production capabilities are not what they once were. And maybe this war in Europe will change that as some of these countries get geared up for defense again. But even that financial aid that EU institutions are giving are helping keep Ukraine stable, keep the economy stable so that the defenders can stay in this fight. And particularly, even if you look at some of those countries in Eastern Europe, Lithuania apparently has pledged commitments to Ukraine about 1.9% of its GDP, and similar figures for Estonia, Norway, Denmark, Latvia, Slovakia, all above 1%. Kate, that's not the impression that you get when you hear these Republicans on the campaign trail. You get the impression that the United States is footing the vast majority of the bill, and these European institutions are freeloading.
Right. And while the state of European militaries is pathetic and those allies need to spend more on their own defense, we also have decided that the world is a safer place when America is the premier global military power. So it shouldn't surprise us that as the leader of the free world, we are having to pick up a bigger share of the military aid. On the economic aid, which has become a very powerful talking point that we're paying for salaries and bureaucrats in Ukraine, Europe has really stepped up and created a multi-year commitment for Ukraine economic support. And, for that matter, if Republicans are concerned that too much of the support going to Ukraine is financial aid and is not lethal aid, well, they could try to negotiate to make more of it lethal aid. But that's not really what's going on. When we had a vote in the House recently over Ukraine aid, where 100 Republicans voted to strip out $300 million of Ukraine aid from a bill, that was money that was marked for the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which is just procuring weapons and training the Ukrainians. It's lethal aid. So what's going on here is really not about economic aid. It is something much more fundamental that has developed in opposition and has lost sight of the broader stakes of what's going on in Ukraine. So if Republicans here could drive a hard bargain from this supplemental request and say, look, we'd like to do some of this, but we'd like to make a much more serious effort to expand U.S. submarine production and get a real plan to get the Navy with as many subs as it needs to have to deter China in the Pacific. And that means we'll have to spend a little less on this other types of aid. They can cut a deal on things like that, but that's not really what's going on. And that's why I think we need to go back to the fundamentals here, which is that these threats are connected. And so they require a kind of connected, comprehensive response. And I think that that's what we're starting to see here, because again, a lot of what we're talking about is ramping up our own production lines, and some of these lines use common parts. And we're talking about building a defense industrial base that's prepared to surge when we need weapons to surge. And that is something that is relevant to what America is facing, not just in supporting Israel and not just in supporting Ukraine, but deterring a conflict in the Pacific and protecting the homeland. So I think this is an unfortunate strain that's developed in the Republican Party. But I also think that after October 7th, it's just become much harder to sustain. It's just becoming more obvious to Americans that the world is getting more dangerous, and that when the U.S. decides it's not interested in being the global power, things start to get dicey really quickly. And so that's why I think Republicans here should get back to the basics on this threat.